Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back to Dallas Hall and the Center for Presidential History, and of course, back to the Hilltop in particular. Thank you to those of you who are alumni back here for homecoming weekend. It's good to have you back. Don't be such a stranger next time. I really want to take this moment to thank our partners for this event, World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and Jim Falk, its leader extraordinaire. There are many people in town that we partner with, and then there's a much smaller subset that we actually enjoy partnering with. And they are there, but don't tell the others. So that would be very nice. A couple of announcements before we move forward. Please check the calendar. We have a couple of exciting events coming up over the rest of the fall. We're going to be discussing Woodrow Wilson on, of course, the 100th anniversary of the closing of the Great War, World War I. And we're also going to be discussing in December the idea of impeachments throughout American history. There have been 3. You can add ellipses there if you like, thus far. So. We'll know a little bit more about that by December, whether that's a likely prospect or not. But the book is actually not about that. It's actually about the actual history, what happened the 3 times previously. I would also remind you, if you're interested, that we are doing our annual trip to the D-Day Normandy beaches yet again this year, London, Paris, and Normandy, with a variety of different, I think the actual ratio of historian to non-historian is about 3 to 1. On that trip. So if you're interested in traveling with students and with other historically minded people and with a bunch of military and diplomatic historians, please ask for more information. It really is a remarkable once-in-a-lifetime trip, which you can go on every year, I guess, but that would be fine too. Before we get to the topic at hand, in fact, as a segue to the topic at hand, I feel it's incumbent upon me, because I have the microphone, to do that uncomfortable thing when someone has the microphone and to draw your attention to something that perhaps is not necessarily why you showed up today, though I think the theme is there. And that is, of course, you all know that our nation is, I think it's fair to say, in a bit of political, cultural, and civic turmoil at this point. The last week in particular has been particularly unpleasant, memorable, and set records that we'd rather not set. In fact, it strikes me that we are today experiencing and celebrating the first Shabbat since the awful event in Pittsburgh last Saturday. That's particularly ironic given that this is the single first time that our center has ever chosen to have an event on a Friday night. Otherwise, I think some of us, myself included, might be elsewhere commemorating and thinking about the people who were lost. And it strikes me that that's particularly important to mention because the book that we're going to be describing tonight and discussing with the author is a book that has particular relevance to that topic. It's a book about political violence, albeit in the 19th century, not the 21st, but about violence nonetheless. And this, I think, forces us to ask, why are we here? Not necessarily in an existential sense, but rather as a historically minded group, as a history center, as a place that's charged with bringing the past into conversation with the present. And I think ultimately it's for that reason, that there are, I think, only a few basic fundamental reasons and lessons that one studies history, aside from the fact that it's much more interesting than any other reality TV show. For me, it comes down to the following 2. I happen to be an old-fashioned person, and I think that there is, in fact, a progressive strain to American history, which is another way of saying, I happen to believe that history is getting better and that America is getting better with every generation. If you look back on the difficulties of the last week and compare them to the difficulties perhaps that we will see in the book tonight, but certainly the difficulties of 1968 or the difficulties of 1929, you will understand that America has always faced difficulties. And in fact, there is, not coincidentally, a Hebrew expression to describe the transfer of the inheritance from one generation to another, lador vidor, which is one generation to another, that we hand our problems from one to the next and hand our solutions from one to the next. And it strikes me that this brings up the second most important critical lesson of American history for me, aside from the idea that things get better, which is that they don't just happen to get better. It is not done by accident, and it is not a rule of the past of American history that things will get better. The only way that things have gotten better in the past is through the difficult, hard concerted, uncomfortable work, uncomfortable such as giving a speech like this, to a crowd that obviously doesn't need it. You're all enlightened folk. But a speech like this that reminds us that we have a charge, not only from the generations that came before, but to the generations that come next, to do the hard work of making America the place that we think it should be. I say that in particular with Election Day coming up. I'm less concerned about who you all vote for than the fact that you do. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity to remind us all that within this country there is the opportunity to make it better, but only if we, this generation, decide to take on that task of handing it to the next. Thank you. Now, to a pleasant topic, and a very particularly pleasant person. It is a great, great honor of mine to introduce Professor Joanne Freeman from Yale University. Joanne and I were discussing on the ride down here just how far back our lives have intertwined, and we're not going to discuss that further because it made us both depressed. I would also like to remind you that in addition to having the opportunity to read Joanne's wonderful work, including this book and also Affairs of Honor, a book about the honor culture of the Revolutionary Era, which really set and helped define the way that we understand today that important topic within American political history of the period, you can also, like me, spend quite a bit of time with Joanne if you choose. She and I actually have a deep relationship because I am with her for at least an hour every week. She is one of the co-hosts of the wonderful podcast Backstory, which looks at American history from a current perspective, but also tries to understand the past on its own terms. If you have not listened to this podcast, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's really good to run to. Just saying. So it's really a wonderful opportunity to explain how it is that Joanne is a person who is able to engage the past and also engage the present, but most importantly, I think for our purposes, engage them both in an engaging fashion. So if you will please join me in welcoming our good friend, Joanne Freeman.
Thank you very much. I'm feeling very engaged. It really is my great pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you about my pretty recently published book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress, and the Road to Civil War, which tells the previously untold story of physical violence in the House and Senate chambers in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Now, in the many years that I've been working on the book, and it took me a lot of years to write the book, I shall admit, I've discovered that most Americans know about one violent incident in Congress. They don't always know the details, they can't always give me names, but over the years, whenever I've said I'm working on a book on violence in Congress, inevitably they go, oh, there was that guy. It's like, yes. So they're thinking of the caning of Senator Charles Sumner, abolitionist senator in 1856, when he was seated at his desk in the Senate chamber. And the book's title is actually taken from a response to that caning. Not very long after the attack, a friend of Sumner's wrote to him and said, and this is a quote, "That blood would flow, somebody's blood, on that field of blood, the floor of Congress, I have fully expected." Now, as a historian, when you find a quote like that, you bow down to the history gods and thank them immensely for that, because that's a remarkable quote. The person who wrote that is saying that, on the one hand, physical violence is not a surprise. He expected it, and he declared that the floor of Congress was, as he put it, the field of blood. This is a story that had not yet been told when I began my research for this book. And yet, there was a lot of violence in the House and Senate chambers between 1830 and 1860. And in fact, I found roughly 70 physically violent incidents in the House and in the Senate in the pre-Civil War Congress. And by physically violent, I mean canings, shoving, fistfights, people pulling knives and guns on each other, duel negotiations, duels, although obviously those are not happening in the House and Senate chambers, wild melees, usually in the House with bunches of men rolling in the aisles and throwing punches, and a handful of street fights with fists, bricks, and the occasional umbrella. Now, I'll bet that many of you are thinking what I myself was thinking at the beginning of this project. That's a very dramatic story, and given how dramatic it sounds, Why hasn't it been told before? I certainly asked myself that question many, many times when I was researching this book, and there is a good answer. In part, no one has found this story because much of the violence was censored out of the period's equivalent of the congressional record. So there are clues in the record which you notice once you realize that the violence is there. So for example, every now and again, the record says that a debate became, quote, unpleasantly personal at one point. Right? Now, if you were reading that, you would think, oh, how unfortunate, they became unpleasantly personal. Well, on one occasion, one congressman pulled a gun on another congressman. That's unpleasantly personal, but you would never know that from that kind of a quote. Or, at another point, the record says, there was a sudden sensation in the corner of the House. Again, who knows what that means? Well, what that actually means, when I did a little digging, is that two congressmen got in a fist fight and they flipped over their desk in the course of fighting. That is a sudden sensation, but you wouldn't know that just from looking at the record. Enormous brawls where there are scores of congressmen involved typically get mentioned, but only in the barest detail, as in the case of one huge fight in 1849 that was summed up in this sort of wonderfully poetic way. Whoever the reporter was had a way with words. He just wrote, he put in brackets in the record, "The House is like a heaving billow." Somehow captures what it must have been like when a huge brawl was going on in the House of Representatives. What you don't see in the record is the kind of detail offered in this account of a house fight that I found in a diary. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that diary in a few minutes. So this is actually someone's description of what he saw and heard. Quote, "The speaker cried at the extent of his voice, 'Order, order, order!' Exclamations from the crowd of 'Damn him, down with him, where are your Bowie knives? Order, gentlemen, for God's sake, come to order. Go it, Arnold, knock him down.'" Okay, that's not found in the record, but that is an eyewitness account of what one of these incidents sounded like and felt like to the person watching. Why is this hidden from the record? In part, this has to do with the nature of the Washington press in this period. In the 1830s, the Washington press consisted of a handful of men working for a handful of local Washington newspapers who sat in the House and Senate, scribbled notes, checked them often with the congressman who'd been speaking, and then published their accounts not only in newspapers but in spin-off publications that essentially acted as a congressional record. The newspapers that these reporters worked for were unquestionably and unapologetically partisan. Objective news was not a goal at this point. So as a reporter, it was in your interest to make your party's congressman look good. It was also in your interest as a reporter to make congressmen look good because Congress granted government printing contracts, and many a newspaper relied on those contracts for survival. Plus, unhappy congressmen occasionally slugged the reporter who made them unhappy. So for reasons of self-preservation, you wanted Congress to be happy. So for all of those reasons, the Washington press smoothed over the rough edges of what happened in Congress. So although sometimes they played up the bravado of many congressmen, they left most of the violent details out. So the answer to the question, why hasn't the story of congressional violence been told, is partly, it's exceedingly hard to find. If you're not looking for it, you won't see it. Now, given what I just said, and given the fact that the equivalent of the congressional record is censored, you're probably then wondering how it is I came to find 70 congressional fights. In fact, you might be wondering how I came across the topic of congressional violence at all. And the truth is, I essentially stumbled across it. When I was first pondering my next book project, to follow my first book, and my first book was Affairs of Honor, which was about the logic of political combat on the national stage in the first 10 years of the government, I knew I wanted to look at politics and combat or violence, and probably honor culture would be in there somehow. I didn't know what I wanted to do next, but I knew that somehow or other those topics would be involved. And I also knew that one congressman killed another in a duel in 1838. So in casting about trying to figure out what I wanted to write about, I went to the private correspondence of a congressman from the same state as the one who had been killed, went in the year when that congressman had been killed and just began reading this congressman's private papers. Now, this particular congressman, as luck would have it, wrote to his wife almost every day, sometimes more than once a day. And I soon found that his letters were filled with moments of violence or near violence. People pushing up their sleeves to throw a punch, people actually throwing punches. There was so much of it that at first I thought he was probably making things up to entertain his wife, although why that would have been entertaining to his wife, I don't know. But in time, I found so much violence in his letters that I assumed there was something here that hadn't been seen before that I really needed to investigate. So I turned to the private letters of other congressmen. And in the 3 months that I spent researching at the Library of Congress, I never opened a congressman's private papers without finding at least one fight. And in the end, by digging in private correspondence and diaries, and then comparing my gleanings with the period's congressional record and with whatever I could uncover in congressional newspaper coverage, I found so much violence that I knew that this was the story I needed to tell. And it's that process of digging and reconstructing and piecing things together is why it took me 17 years to write the book. It took me a very long time. I tell my students it took me as long as they've been alive to write my book. Now, not surprisingly, when you look at the violence over the 30-year period at the heart of the book, you see patterns. So for one thing, you definitely see the power of political bullying. Generally speaking, congressmen divided their ranks into two kinds of men, and these are actually their phrases, and the fact that they called each other these names tells you a lot about the culture of Congress. Congressmen divided their ranks into fighting men and non-combatants. They would, at the beginning of a session, try and determine who the fighting men were in the group, and sometimes if they were engaged in a dispute, they would ask, are you a fighting man or are you a non-combatant? That would affect their behavior. Most fighting men were Southerners or Southern-born Westerners. They tended to be armed. They tended to be more willing to fight. Most Northerners were non-combatants, which means that generally speaking, Southerners bullied Northerners in Congress, often to protect the institution of slavery. They insulted and threatened and sometimes assaulted Northerners to intimidate them into compliance or silence. And for a time, that strategy worked quite well. So for a time, Southerners wielded an outsized influence on the floor of Congress and protected their slave regime in the process. Now, for a time in the 1830s and for part of the 1840s, much of the fighting was between men of different parties. So for the most part, you had Whigs fighting Democrats, and both parties had their share of fighting men, so the fighting seemed generally fair to those who were there at the time. But in the 1850s, things began to change, partly because of Western expansion and the rising problem of slavery on Western lands. The nation's slavery problem intensified, and national politics became increasingly polarized. At the same time, a new form of technology, the telegraph, made matters worse by transmitting news around the nation with breakneck speed before politicians could spin the news as they saw fit. The end result was more violence in Congress, particularly given that the American public was increasingly cheering on their congressmen to fight for their rights. And this was true for Northerners as well as Southerners. As Northerners got a sense of the degree to which their representatives were being silenced, they began voting fighting men into Congress. The anti-slavery Republican Party came to power in the mid-1850s based on their promise to fight what they called the slave power, and that is actually their rhetoric. We, the Republican Party, are here to fight the slave power. In Congress, working alongside Southerners, these Northern fighting men stayed true to their promise, fighting Southerners with resistance, fists, and occasionally with guns. Again and again during debate, Republicans rose to their feet and insisted they were a new kind of Northerner, a Northerner who had been sent to Congress to fight. And I want to offer you just a couple of paragraphs from the book because they describe a document that I found towards the beginning of my research, which really captured for me the sort of intensity of this moment and what it meant. Toward the start of my research, I discovered poignant testimony to the power of congressional threats and violence. It took the form of a confidential memorandum with 3 signatures on the bottom: Benjamin Franklin Wade, who was a Republican from Ohio, Zachariah Chandler, a Republican from Michigan, and Simon Cameron, a Republican from Pennsylvania. And it told a striking story. One night in 1858, Wade, Chandler, and Cameron, all anti-slavery, decided that they'd had enough of Southern insults and bullying. Outraged by the onslaught of abuse, they made a difficult decision. Swearing loyalty to one another, they vowed to challenge future offenders to duels and, as they put it, quote, fight to the coffin. There seemed to be no other way to stem the flow of Southern insults than to fight back Southern style. This was no easy choice. They fully expected to be ostracized back home. In the North, dueling was condemned as a barbaric Southern custom. But that punishment seemed no worse than the humiliation that they faced every day in Congress. So they made their plans known, and according to their statement, they had something of an impact. Quote, when it became known that some Northern senators were ready to fight for sufficient cause, the tone of Southern insults softened, although the abuse went on. Now, the story is dramatic, but what affected me most when I first read it was the way the 3 men told it. Even years later, they could barely contain themselves. What they called, quote, gross personal abuse had an impact on these men, and it was mighty. Not only did it threaten their very manhood, as they put it, on a daily basis, but by silencing Northern congressmen, it deprived their constituents of their representative rights. They considered this, quote, an unendurable outrage that made them frantic with rage and shame. To Wade, Chandler, and Cameron, sustained Southern bullying wasn't a mere matter of egos and parliamentary power plays. It struck at the heart of who they were as men and threatened the very essence of representative government. They had to do something, and they did. These men were doing their best to champion their cause and their constituents in trying times, and they said so in their statement. They had written it, quote, for those who come after us to study, as an example of what it once cost to be in favor of liberty and to express such sentiments in the highest places of official life in the United States. They were pleading with posterity, with us, to understand how threatened they had felt, how frightened they had been, how much it had taken for them to fight back, and thus how valuable was their cause. In a handful of paragraphs, they bore witness to the presence and power of congressional violence. When I first read their plea, it brought tears to my eyes. It was so immediate and yet so far away. It was also stunningly human, expressing anger and outrage and shame and fear and pride all in one. Not only did it bring the subject of this book to living, breathing life, but it showed how it felt to be part of it. By offering a glimpse of the emotional reality of their struggle, Wade, Chandler, and Cameron opened a window onto the lost world of congressional violence. This is an amazing document, and it actually did. I don't know how often a document has made me cry, but the document did, because they said, we're offering you this for posterity. We want to explain to posterity how hard it was to fight slavery in the highest institutions in the land. And so it did, on some level, feel that they were talking to me. And you can see, given that statement, why the late 1850s ended up being the bloodiest years in congressional history. These congressmen were being elected and urged by their constituents to fight. So the field of blood doesn't tell a story of violent congressmen isolated in Washington. It's a story of a nation being torn in two, with Americans cheering on their congressmen to fight. I found one particularly dramatic example of this link between congressmen, congressional violence, and the public in an 1856 newspaper. That year, a Massachusetts congressman heading back to Washington was met at the train station by a group of his constituents with a gift for him to take back to Washington. It was a gun, and it was inscribed with the words, "Free Speech." These people wanted their congressman to fight for their rights, and fight, congressmen did. Now, it's a dramatic story, and it's a story that the field of blood doesn't tell from on high. It actually gets down on the ground with congressmen and with the American public to recreate what it felt like to watch one's nation be torn in two. It explores how Americans came to turn on each other as enemies over time. Now, to capture the intensity of this process of national reckoning, the book has a kind of guide of sorts at its center, and his name is Benjamin Brown French. French was a minor clerk in Congress. He's the clerk of Congress for one little window, but mostly he's just a minor clerk. He moved in congressional circles for decades. He comes from a small New Hampshire town, comes to Washington because he has a job, and stays there basically for the decades that my book covers. And he ended up being a true godsend to me when I was writing the book, because he kept a diary, an 11-volume diary. And it's not a boring sort of had lunch with Mr. Jones and it's rainy out today kind of a diary. It's a historian's gold kind of a diary in which he talks about his reflections and his feelings and what he sees and what he hears. It's filled with how he's experiencing his world over time, and since his job was to sit in Congress and watch what was going on, he tended to write down a lot of the detail about the actual fighting in the House. And I'll also add, I couldn't for a while, I was trying to decide if he was the Zelig or the Forrest Gump, but I think Forrest Gump is the right character. He's the Forrest Gump of antebellum America, because if something is happening of great significance in Washington in this period, somehow Benjamin Brown French is there. And when I was writing the book, I truly thought people were going to think I made him up. So for example, someone tries to assassinate Andrew Jackson when he's president. Benjamin Brown French sees it happen. John Quincy Adams goes back to serve in the House after his presidency, has a stroke in the House. Who's there not long after holding his hand? Benjamin Brown French. Gettysburg Address being delivered. Who is up on the platform near Lincoln as the address is being delivered? Benjamin Brown French. And in that case, if you end up looking at the book, I even found a picture that shows Lincoln and French so that you can actually see I'm not making it up, it's true. And, of course, the night of Lincoln's assassination, who is at Lincoln's bedside? Benjamin Brown French. So he's an amazing eyewitness for a lot of reasons, an amazing source of evidence. But more than that, what makes him remarkable for this book is that he undergoes a remarkable, revealing transition over the years covered by the book. So he comes to Washington in 1833 as what at the time would have been called a dough-face Democrat, meaning a Northern Democrat willing to do anything to appease the South and promote his party and hopefully, in his mind, to save the Union. By the end of the book, he goes out to buy a gun in case he needs to shoot some Southerners. So my thought when I began this book was if I can really explore and understand what drives this character who at the beginning of the book likes everybody and everybody likes him and he's trying to smooth things over, how you get from that point to being a guy who goes into town to buy a gun in case he needs to shoot Southerners, if I could explain that transformation, that's getting at the coming of the Civil War in a really different kind of a way. So by following along with him over the course of the book, you basically end up really feeling how he and many Americans turned on each other. In essence, French enables me to explore what I call the emotional logic of disunion, the gradual process by which Americans learned to turn on each other to the point of violence. I also can't resist, because I just can never resist, talking about the diary entry where he talks about buying the gun, because it's such a wonderful example of both the dailiness of history and the nature of historical research. So in his diary, he talks about how by this point in time he's a Republican and he's worried because the Southerners are being not very nice to the Republicans and he feels threatened. So he says in his diary entry, I feel threatened, so I went into town today and I bought one of those little guns that I can keep on my person at all times because if they're going to attack us for our ideas, I feel the need to be armed. In the same diary entry, he then says, I also bought 2 pairs of underwear, $1 a pair, and I have a pair on now, and they're very comfortable. And what I love about that, above and beyond the fact that I get to tell an underwear joke when I'm talking about my book, we don't experience history often as capital H history. This is a man who was on his way towards civil war. He didn't know that. he went in to buy a gun and he bought some underwear, and they're both in his diary entry. It's about the dailiness of life and the dailiness of history, and also the wonderful nature of historical research when you find things buried amidst other things that are amazingly valuable but are just part of someone's life. So I couldn't resist quoting that. Now, 17 years ago when I began this book, I never could have imagined how strikingly relevant it would be when it appeared in print. Every time there was a congressional election in those 17 years, I would say, "Come on, Joanne, you can finish the book for the election." And then I didn't, until this year. Such are the whims of the writing gods. And it is impossible to miss the modern echoes of The Field of Blood when you consider current events. So The Field of Blood tells a story of extreme polarization, fundamental disagreements about what kind of nation the United States would be, splintering political parties, new technologies skewing and scattering the news and complicating politics in the process, conspiracy theories being spread north and south as the nation's crisis unfolds, panic about the impact of free speech in that fraught environment, and rampant distrust in national political institutions, as well as rampant distrust of Americans in each other. Now, obviously, that all sounds somewhat familiar. I'm not saying that we're reliving the 1850s, and I'm not saying that we're headed into a civil war. History doesn't repeat, but it teaches. And on that count, I think The Field of Blood has much to say to the present about the power and dangers of extreme polarization, about the importance of having trust and faith in national political institutions, about the dangerous power and persuasion of conspiracy theories to turn Americans against each other, about the importance of trust in our national system of government and of Americans in each other, and about the role of Congress, when Congress is fully functional, in creating and preserving a national we. The founding generation considered the study of history to be vital to protecting the American Republic. They assumed that only by understanding events of the past could Americans recognize threats in the present. In that spirit, and in a desire to offer you some fascinating history filled with good stories, some famous and not so famous people, and momentous events that shaped the nation, I offer you The Field of Blood, and I hope for those of you who wander out and get it after this point, I hope that you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. As you know, we have microphones that will come to either side. If I could ask you to wait for the microphone so everybody could hear your question, that would be wonderful. And Professor, I think you're more than qualified to call on people yourself.
Okay. Questions? Does anyone have questions?
Yes. I was down at Williamsburg a few years ago. I used to teach history at night at this Richland Junior College here, so I know a little bit about it. But the thing is, this guy, he was the newspaper person at Colonial Williamsburg, and he was saying that newspapers didn't become affordable until the 1850s. Before that, they cost like a week's wage. And I've always thought that that was probably a big reason for the Civil War, too, because the proliferation of these newspapers fan these flames kind of like social media does today, I think.
Well, for sure, you're right, that changes in technology, like the steam-powered printing press, actually the railroad, there are any number of things that certainly bring down the price. The penny press is coming out in this period. So for sure, I mean, it makes sense, right? If democracy is a big conversation between politicians and the public, any form of technology that changes that conversation is going to have an impact on the nation itself. So for sure, I agree that that's part of what goes on in this time period.
Yes, I listened to Mr. Clapper's speech at the World Affairs Council, and he was saying that he thought that social media should be regulated.
Well, I can't, so the comment was whether social media should be regulated or not. I can't speak to that. What I can say is, and certainly it struck me when I was writing the book, was the way in which people were talking about the telegraph. There's so much similarity, a form of technology that communication changed and became much more less spin controlled and quicker, and political information was spreading throughout the nation, and people weren't sure anymore what was true and what wasn't because they got the news so fast. Certainly that connection between social media and the telegraph and the ways in which they kind of scrambled the political cycle was very striking when I was writing the book. There's an anecdote that I discuss in the book that takes place in 1850. And there's, in the Senate, one senator pulls a gun on another senator, and there's a scramble, and the gun is grabbed out of his hands, and nothing happens. And another senator stands up at that moment and says, I feel the need to say something. I hope that the Senate realizes that because of the telegraph, the nation in 45 minutes is going to be reading that we're slaughtering each other with guns. And we'd better appoint a committee to investigate this so that the nation will feel that we've got this in hand. And you can feel the Senate kind of thinking, uh-oh, like the nation probably will be hearing that within 45 minutes. So technology and democracy intersect in a lot of really interesting ways. Oh, okay. Is there someone on that side? Yep.
Does your study of the period make you, does it lead you to the conclusion that by the late 1850s, war was inevitable or close to it, or were there some mess-ups along the way that maybe things could have gone otherwise?
Well, I don't like to see anything in history as inevitable. As a historian, that kind of makes me want to clench my fists. That said, it's hard to see how ultimately, in the big picture, there was going to be a compromise on slavery that somehow was going to magically solve this situation. They kept trying and trying and trying, obviously, over the course of the 19th century to make compromises, none of which resolved this problem. So the problem of slavery and the expansion of the nation and the fact that obviously every time a new state entered the Union, the question would come up again, is this going to be a free state or a slave state? Somehow or other, that problem was going to have to be reconciled. So, you know, I won't say it's inevitable. I don't know how else that would have been resolved. The Southerners certainly were not going to say, yeah, okay, we back away. I mean, when you read, so one of the things that the book shows is both sides of the Union, North and South, increasingly, the word they use all the time is degradation. You're degrading us. The South feels they're being degraded because slavery is being attacked or bound into the South. The North feels degraded because their congressmen are being silenced. So, you know, the book, it's a powerful combination of political and sectional and personal and emotional that kind of gets bound together in a way that really heightens the crisis in this period.
I thought it was so funny that you started out by talking about this movement that you made, because actually in talking to people this week about coming here tonight, that is the one story, or even a movement of caning. Why is that one story one that got out and the rest of them? I mean, I have no idea why I even know that. I don't remember learning it, but...
I think most people, I mean, it's sincere when I said that, 17 years is a long time, and over those 17 years, 99.9% of the time when I said I'm writing about violence in Congress, if nothing else, people knew that. I think that stands out in part because at the time, it stood out not because it was violent, and I think that's the way it's taught, is, oh my gosh, how shocking, there was a violent incident in Congress. Obviously, there was a lot of violence in Congress, and part of the reason why the caning of Charles Sumner has the impact that it has is because there were a number of other violent incidents that happened right before it. So it felt like a chain of events. But the way in which that unfolded, the caning of Sumner, it actually kind of violated the rules of violence, and because of that, it was extra shocking at the time. So, for example, if you were going to deliberately attack someone as opposed to lose your temper and slug him, you were supposed to do that outside. And Preston Brooks from South Carolina, who did the caning, actually waited for 2 days outside to try and get Sumner outside of the Capitol because he knew that that's what you're supposed to do, and then lost his patience and went in and caned him in the Senate chamber. Now, of course, the symbolism of that, right? A senator sitting at his desk and being brutally caned to the ground by a Southerner. If you're worried about your representatives and your senators being silenced by the slave power, it couldn't be more apparent and blunt than that. So that act in and of itself had a power that is precisely why those sorts of attacks are supposed to be outside. Now, Sumner, on the other hand, typically if you were not a fighting man, and he certainly was not a fighting man in the Southern vein, you certainly could be aggressive in your rhetoric, but you probably shouldn't be deliberately insulting. Because if you were deliberately insulting, then you were sort of setting things up that there was going to have to be a reconciling. Now, he was deliberately insulting. He really, in the letters that he wrote before he gave the speech that led to the caning, he says, I want to rile up the Southerners. Kansas is what we're talking about now, so Kansas it will be. So he was trying to make that kind of a point, but as he was making that speech, there were people in the back of the Senate chamber, actually Stephen Douglas, saying, damn fool's going to get himself attacked by some other damn fool. So he was also behaving in a way that wasn't typical. So I think for all of those reasons, it ends up being a more deeply symbolic act than some of the other acts of violence. And it's seen that way at the time. It has a huge impact throughout the nation at the time. And I think that carries over, and that's why that becomes the one incident that, if you're talking about the story of the coming of the Civil War, the caning of Sumner is always part of that. Other questions? Maybe this fellow back here.
Hi, I was curious about violence in other sectionalized federal venues like Supreme Court, presidential cabinets. Also wondering if your study extended into Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction Congress?
Okay, so I can't say that I did an enormously detailed search in all institutions of government. I wish I had. But I will say, aside from random incidents now and again, it's really Congress as a representative institution where North and South are together in a room having to sort of literally fight this out, that most of the violence is taking place. I should say, too, that there was violence, some violence in state legislatures. So it's not as though Congress is entirely unique. America was violent during these decades, and politics was violent, and legislatures were violent. So it's also of a piece with the time. As far as the later Congresses go, the book really stops with the opening of the Civil War, but the epilogue looks a bit ahead in time. One of the things that I discovered is, and this is logical, right? The South leaves, they secede from the Union, Southerners leave Congress, and the fighting stops. The Confederate Congress, however, that was full of violence. So the Southerners left Washington and went south, and the same people who were fighting in Congress were fighting in the Confederate Congress. Reconstruction, so the South comes back to the Union when they try to get back in and they arrive in Washington to go through the process of trying to get back into the Union, they bring with them some fighting. But the dynamics have changed. So there are 2 or 3 moments in which there's something violent happens, but the Northerners, having won that war, essentially point to this and say, do we really want to let them back in the Union? Because do you all remember what this was like when they were here? So the Southerners, they have a very different dynamic. They no longer, it doesn't have the impact that it once had. A lot of the violence that they were using on the national stage then gets turned on the South. And during Reconstruction, a lot of the violence that's taking place is in the South. Is there a question from this side?
Yeah.
Microphone is coming your way.
The Library of Congress, was that a repository of a lot of your reference materials? And if so, what part?
What part of the Library of Congress? Yeah, the Library of Congress, I spent 3 months there in the manuscript division, really just rummaging through endless collections of the papers of congressmen. So that was where I started. I couldn't have done the project without databases. Like newspaper databases, the number of obscure congressmen whose memoir is digitized and on Google Books. There were a lot of ways in which, thinking back, I could actually read the equivalent of the congressional record online. The Library of Congress actually has a website that includes it. See something there that looked suspicious to me, go to a newspaper database and look it up to see if I could find something on it, and then go to Google Books to see if a congressman's memoirs were there who maybe talked about it. That was remarkable to be able to do all of that sitting at my desk. But I also did meander all over the country going to archives because, as my talk suggested, it's really private correspondence and diaries that were the best, particularly letters to wives. Is that when congressmen wrote to their wives, they admit to being scared. They admit that there's one fellow who says, I wish I were a bigger guy. You know, he's sitting in the house and he's seeing all of this fighting and he wishes he was bigger. So it was letters to wives often that were the most revealing, and often it's these small collections that haven't been digitized, so there was a lot of archive hopping as well. Other questions? Jeffrey?
It was a wonderful talk. You know, I want to flip the switch, if you will, switch the direction. You know, there's such a natural tendency, as you already described, to want to understand our own time in terms of what we can learn from the 1840s and 50s and 60s. But let me go in the opposite direction for a second, which is to remind you, not that you need a reminder, of the horrible incident that occurred just a few years ago with the Congress, where a Republican congressperson was shot practicing for a softball game. And what was notable about that violence, I think, was the reaction that Congress had, which was, I think, best described as a kumbaya moment, that Speaker Ryan, Minority Leader Pelosi stood up in the well of the Congress and said, an attack against one is an attack against us all, and that we must stop the political violence. So two-part question. The first is, what examples were there of people during the period you're studying of people trying to tamp down the violence from on high? And the second is, I was struck when Ryan and Pelosi made that statement at how utterly out of touch it was with the rest of America. Because they said an attack against one of us is an attack against all of us, not recognizing that there are several hundred shootings across the country every day that they seem uninterested in doing anything about. So were there similar reactions that Congress was a separate entity from the rest of the nation in those tamping down moments in the 1850s?
Okay, so two-part question. So the first part is, were people doing anything at the time? So typically, I talk about how Southerners tended to be fighting men, Northerners tended to be non-combatants. Usually after there was a brawl of some kind, it would be the Northerners who would stand up and say, the rules, what about the rules? We must enforce the rules. This is not the way things should be. Southerners would typically say, enforce the rules all you want. You're going to be laughed out of the South. No, we don't care about those rules per se. And nothing would really happen. John Quincy Adams called these pleas for the rules to be enforced lamentation speeches. There'd be a fight, and then he'd write in his diary, and the lamentation speeches start. So there would be discussion of it, but I really think there was a sense that it was a man-to-man thing, and you sort of, if it was a fair fight, you let it go, and it would play its way out. There's an instance I write about in the book in which there's a fellow sitting at his desk, a congressman sitting at his desk writing, and he looks up and he sees someone standing across from a colleague with his fist clenched. And he clearly assumes something bad is going to happen. And as he explains it, he looks his colleague up and down, and he looks the stranger up and down, and his colleague is a bigger man, and he says, well, if they're going to fight, probably my colleague's going to win. And he goes back to work, which tells you something. He then looks up and realizes they've begun fighting, but he can't tell if the stranger is armed. He thinks maybe he sees a weapon. So he gets up and stands behind the stranger, waiting. If he reaches for a weapon, he's going to stop him, because that makes it an unfair fight. But as long as he doesn't reach for the weapon, it's a fair fight, and he lets it go. So there's some way in which it's obviously it's exceedingly political, but there's a personal dimension as well, and sort of sectional degradation and personal degradation. All of these things are mixed in an interesting kind of a way. So it actually, for Northerners, sometimes it was hard for them to protest, because then they ended up seeming cowardly. There's a section of the book that talks about Northerners who would stand up and protest against dueling and Southern violence, and they always had a little bit of chest beating. You know, I'm not scared. I'll stand here and I'll fight anybody, but I do feel the need to say. So it was a hard thing, I think, for people in that body. Now, the second part of your question was being in touch with the rest of the nation or not. Well, it's interesting. I think they very much felt that they were in touch with the rest of the nation because the rest of the nation is encouraging them to fight. There's, my most frequent fighter is a fellow from Virginia named Henry Wise. And he was all over the papers in that first collection I looked at, fighting all the time. And there's a period in which someone says, you know, you should be ashamed of yourself. How can you behave that way on a routine basis? You should be thrown out of this body. And Wise says, try it. I'm going to be sent home, and they're going to immediately reelect me and put me right back here because this is what they put me here to do. I am here to fight. And in a period when there are a lot of one-term wonders in Congress, you know, there's this constant churning change in Congress. He's reelected 6 times. So I think they're very much aware. For a while, the Southerners, and then in time, the Northerners as well, are very much in tune with what they think their constituents want. The Northerners are held back from responding because they're worried what their constituents will think. So I think in that way, they actually are in tune.
So speaking to that, the silly duel?
The Silly Graves duel?
Yes. How did they know the code of the duel? Because you talk about how one side knew all of the codes that were needed and the other side didn't. What communication was there? How did some guys know and some guys didn't?
It's a great question. So the one chapter of the book does talk about the fatal congressional duel in which one congressman kills another congressman, and one is a Northerner and one is a Southerner, and the Northerner and his team are not necessarily well-versed in the rules of the Code of Honor. In that case, border state men were very handy in those sorts of situations because, in a sense, they talked North and South. You know, they were culturally familiar with the North and South. So, for example, there's a period in the negotiations of that duel in which someone tries to deliver a letter to the New Englander who won't take it. And he goes to Henry Clay and says, I don't know what to do. I tried to deliver him a letter and he wouldn't take the letter. Now what do I do? And Clay apparently said, no, he's a Yankee. You have to say it this way. Then he'll take the letter. So they were consulting with each other. And when you look at the unfolding of that fight, what you see is something happens and then everybody runs to their friends who know something and asks them questions and then run back and respond and then run out. So the Southerners are much more familiar with that. But for a time, in the early years when national political parties really were, cross-sectional, you had within your party, your team, people from the South who understood that code. So it was kind of built in. And so that helped as well.
Could I tell you to ask to tell people the story about the 10 commandments?
The 10 Duel Commandments, the play?
Yeah, but your interaction with that. You've told me.
Okay. So a request for a story. So in Affairs of Honor, there's a chapter on dueling. And I talk about the rules of dueling, and in the earlier period, it was not so much a Southern practice. So when and I promise it'll get back to dueling. The first time I went to see the musical Hamilton, I was sitting in the audience, and there's a song called The 10 Duel Commandments. And the song begins, and they're singing the rules of dueling, and first I'm thinking, excellent, there's a dueling rules song, this is wonderful. And then I think, wait, that sounds really familiar. And then they sing, there's a lyric that comes from a document that I found at the New York Historical Society. And so when that lyric came out, I realized they're singing my book. And indeed, when I met Lin Miranda and I said, is that song based on my book? He said, well, yeah, of course. So I get to be the historian who has some little tiny bit of her book being sung on Broadway.
So could you comment on all this chaos was going on in Congress for decades. What effect did it have in the state chambers and in the city chambers? Was the same thing going on, or what was going on?
There was some violence in state legislatures. It was not quite on a par with congressional violence. Like there's a brawl in Boston in I want to say the early 1850s, and the reporter who covers it says, wow, this would have made a sensation even in Congress. So there was, politics was remarkably violent throughout this period. Rioting, mobbing, deaths, elections, routinely people died in elections because of the fighting at polling places. So there was this going on. What was interesting about Congress to me, and part of what intrigued me at the beginning of the project, is that you have people with slightly different rules of fighting. And what happens when you put them in a room together and they have to work on incredibly fraught topics. So I just wanted to know what happens. What happens when they're combating each other, and how does that shape what's going on in the national government? So that's what kind of pulled me into this particular topic.
I think we have time for one more question. I see it. Yes.
Thank you. It makes me nervous to be last. My question is, your book spans basically the antebellum period. How much of the 70 incidences directly relate to the issue of controversy over the slave issue, or tangentially, the expansion of slavery, et cetera, or how much of it might have been related to other issues of the time period, like the crazy stuff that happened during Polk's presidency, the 54-40 fight, and the Oregon Territory, the battle over Texas, the Mexican War, et cetera, et cetera?
So initially, some of the fighting involves slavery, and some of it is about party politics. So, for example, Henry Wise stands up and says the Democratic Party is corrupt, and a Democrat stands up and objects to that, and then you begin to have a fight. Over time, it becomes extremely slavery-centric, but initially there's a party component to it. Okay.
Well, and let me suggest to you, this is a wonderful book, a wonderful read. It's never too early to purchase something for the holiday season. And you are guaranteed that when you go to Broadway in 7 years, there'll be a chapter here that you'll be able to hear listening to sung about.
I have to say, though, I gave a copy of it to Lin Miranda, and I inscribed in it, "You don't have to make a musical about this book."
Your lawyer would disagree.
Yeah.
So really, copies are available for signing. If you would, pick one up on the way out, and thank you again for coming.